Okay, thanks very much, Claire. I'd like to welcome everybody and thank you all for coming. Um, First of all, I'd like to say a thank you to Roy for designing the leaflet and also to Katie and Claire for helping to put this on. But thank you all for coming as well. For those of you that don't know me, I'll say a little bit. Like Claire, I'm a member of the West Suffolk Bury St Edmunds and Stowmarket group. Um, I was a senior university lecturer in sociology. Prior to that, I was a carpenter and joiner who worked on building sites before I went back to university as a mature student because I was blacklisted and I was still on a blacklist 30 years later for trade union activities. Um, I was a senior university lecturer at several universities and also external examiner for sociology at two universities over a 30-year period. And since retiring, um, I've kept my hand in, as it were, as a part-time tutor for the WEA, the Open University, and more recently, the University of the Third Age. Now, the first thing to say is I'm not a political scientist nor a historian, but I have been an active trade union member for 62 years now. I also studied full time at Middlesex for the Certificate in Industrial Relations and Trade Union Studies, which included courses on labour history and politics. Having said all that, some of you probably do know far more about some of the things I'll be talking about. And also just to say that I just do what I know about. Our branch, or proto branch as it is at the moment, are doing lots of things to create a friendly, welcoming atmosphere as we try to build a mass socialist party. I just happened to mention one day that I'd do a series of talks if people wanted me to, and it's snowballed since then. Um, Now, most people welcomed this, but some people outside our branch, and especially on Facebook, have been more critical, saying things like it shouldn't be called political education. Okay, let's change it to talks on politics then. Some have said it should be discussion rather than talks. Um, that's after I'd already written some of the talks. Some said it wasn't theoretical enough, and some even throwing insults at me, saying it was infantile what I was doing. Well, all I can say is that that's not the way we operate in our branch. Um, all I can say is that I'm doing this for nothing. Everyone, including myself, have put a great deal of effort into putting these talks on. And I do note that the so-called critics have not offered to do something that they think is better. Um, and that kind of behaviour is not the way socialists should behave towards one another. In our branch, we show respect to one another's efforts to try and build the party. But I don't want to labour that point. Most weeks, I intend to talk for about an hour and leave about half an hour for questions and discussion. That will vary from week to week. Now, if it's okay with everyone, I've agreed to the talks being recorded, and I think Claire's already put the recording on. Um, so anyway, let's carry on. Um, oh, what's going on here? Oh, there we go. Right. These are the political talks that I intend to do. And the first one, as you can see, is the Industrial Revolution and Working Class Struggle. But you'll notice that if you've had the leaflet, that the last one I've actually changed. And I've changed the last one because I think the Employment Rights Act is very important for people to know about. Um, and the briefing that I'll do is, warts and all. because there's lots of things wrong with it. But there are some advances to be made. So anyway, with everybody's agreement, let's get on with it. Most of this you'll probably know already, but I'll give a kind of background. In the late 18th and early 19th, well, to the mid 19th centuries, Britain was transformed from mainly a rural society into one based on industrial production and whose population was increasingly based in fast expanding towns. Some towns like Manchester were small villages just 70 years earlier. But the Industrial Revolution not only meant large scale industry, but also it meant poverty, exploitation, unfettered competition, and slum housing as the working class became concentrated into giant urban conurbations. Indeed, later on in the 1840s, Frederick Engels was sent to Manchester to work in his father's textile mill, and he was so shocked at what he saw that in 1844 he wrote this devastating critique of the capitalist system, which documents in great detail the condition of the English working class. And if you've read it, you'll know that it ends with a very harrowing account of life in the workhouses. So at the beginning of the 19th century, workers had no rights at all. They didn't have the vote, and the notorious Combination Acts of 1799 and 1800 had banned every kind of combination or meeting leading to combination of workers. So, because they had no democratic rights or say in how their lives were governed, workers had little alternative but to break the law to get some change. Now, you've probably heard of the Luddites, maybe not. So, what the Luddites did was, as new machinery was destroying jobs and traditional ways, between 1811 and 1816, textile workers in particular organised raids at night to smash the machinery. It started in Nottingham, but it quickly spread across the country. Now, if you don't know the origin of the word Luddites, they described themselves as Luddites because they were followers of Ned Ludd, who was a legendary weaver whose name was used as a pseudonym in threatening letters that were sent to mill owners and government officials. Now, mill and factory owners took to shooting anyone they caught, and eventually the movement was suppressed by legal and military force, which included execution and penal transportation, usually to Australia. At the same time, fearing the influence of ideas that had inspired the French Revolution, the Tory government of 1815 was determined to crush political protest. Radicalism was widespread and it was expressed in demonstrations and rebellions. Remember that political power was still in the hands of the aristocracy. Only about 400,000 men had the vote. So parliamentary reform was a major campaigning issue. So on this slide, the Peterloo Massacre, which is named after the Battle of Waterloo, took place at St Peter's Field in Manchester on the 16th of August 1819. What happened was cavalry charged into a crowd of peaceful 60,000 peaceful demonstrators who'd gathered to demand parliamentary representation. If you've never seen the film, try to get to see Mike Leigh's film on the Peterloo Massacre. It came out in 2018, but now you can buy it or rent it on YouTube. It's a very good film, it's very accurate. Also, after the massacre, Percy Bysshe Shelley, his response was the poem The Mask of Anarchy, that ends like this. And we should never forget those last 5 lines. Rise like lions after slumber in unvanquishable number. Shape your chains to earth like dew, which in sleep had fallen on you. Ye are many, they are few. One consequence of the Peterloo massacre was that the government introduced the Newspaper and Stamp Duties Act in 1819 to try to stop the spread of political propaganda by radical newspapers, forcing them to become uneconomic. However, many political tracts and newspapers defied the infamous stamp tax, as it was called, that made newspapers so expensive as to be beyond workers, and the act was aimed to restrict publications deemed critical of the government. The duty, the tax, was intended to raise revenue and control the press, particularly targeting radical publications associated with figures like William Cobbett. That's how newspapers came to be regarded as the fourth estate, holding the power of the church, the commons, and the lords to account. Those are the 3 primary estates, and newspapers were the fourth estate. Well, they originally did, but as we all know, by the 20th century, most newspapers had come to be owned by wealthy press barons who had an interest in protecting the establishment. But the Industrial Revolution didn't just affect urban workers, it also greatly changed the countryside for rural labourers. Now, one of the main autumn and winter jobs for farm labourers was threshing. This meant separating the grain from the stalks of corn by beating it. But in the late 1820s and early 1830s, farmers began to introduce threshing machines to do this work. Now, this put large numbers of labourers out of work and without enough money to support themselves during the winter months. So, low wages and unemployment, plus there were also poor harvests in 1829 and 1830, resulted in hunger, protests, and disturbances in the countryside, especially in the east and south of England, especially in this area where we actually live. I know you don't all live in East Anglia, but many of you do. And farmers were sent threatening letters demanding that wages increase or at least stay the same. And these letters often demanded farmers not to use threshing machines. Machines were smashed, and farmers and landowners also had their hayricks and farm buildings set on fire. Now, why are they called the swing riots? Well, the reason they're called the swing riots is because protesters used the name Captain Swing. This was a made-up name, but it was intended to spread fear amongst landowners and protect the protesters from discovering. However, as a consequence of all these riots, there was parliamentary reform, but the 1832 Reform Act only extended the franchise to the bourgeois class of large industrialists, dashing the hopes of working people who dubbed the 1832 Act the Great Betrayal. Nevertheless, the Combination Acts prohibiting trade unionism were repealed in 1824. And although trade union activity was limited by a new act, the 1825 Combination Act, unions developed rapidly, especially in the factory-based textile industry. It's interesting to note that women were actually prominent in these trade unions. Now, there were attempts to form general unions of all workers, irrespective of their trade. These were inclusive unions, and I'll explain what we mean by inclusive unions. Inclusive unions are ones where every working class person is encouraged to join. William Benbow and Welsh socialist Robert Owen and others looked upon trade unionism not just as a means for protecting and improving workers' living standards, but also as a vehicle for changing the entire political and economic order of society. Robert Owen, in particular, experimented with cooperative ventures as an attempt to bypass the existing order of wage slavery. The most famous general union, the Grand National Consolidated Trades Union, the GNCTU, was set up in 1833. In a very short time, it had over 1 million members. The following year, however, the government attempted to smash the union by arresting 6 agricultural labourers from the village of Tolpuddle in Dorset. These 6 labourers had met under a tree in the village and had agreed to join the Grand National Consolidated Trade Union. They were accused and found guilty in a show trial of administering illegal oaths. They were transported to Australia. There was a mass national campaign, first of all, to prevent the sentences being carried out, and although that was unsuccessful, in that immediate aim, the protests continued and succeeded in pressurising the government to eventually commute the sentences. But only a couple of them returned to Britain. However, the Grand National Consolidated Trade Union collapsed shortly afterwards because workers feared the same fate as the Dorset labourers. There's a commemoration march and rally in Tolpuddle every year, as you can see here. And I don't know whether anyone can spot Jeremy Corbyn in the crowd there. If you look to the left of your screen, you'll see him in a light blue shirt, I think it is. Anyway, meanwhile, the temporary defeat of trade unionism in 1834 led to working class activity concentrating on securing the franchise through the Chartist movement. The movement was based on demands of a 6-point charter, and this commanded mass support, which led to the presentation of 3 massive petitions to Parliament in 1839, 1842, and 1848. It contained millions of signatures. It's the biggest petition that there has ever been, although there are, in Britain at least anyway, although there are claims that many of the names were on the petition were bogus after the discovery of Queen Victoria's name appearing several times on the charter. What were the six demands? Well, the first one was equal electoral districts. This was to ensure no more so-called rotten boroughs. Rotten boroughs were abolished by the 1832 Reform Act. What rotten boroughs were constituencies that elected two MPs from a tiny electorate. The second thing was the abolition of property qualifications for MPs. These qualifications required a candidate to own land or property of a certain value. This was intended to ensure that MPs, they said, that MPs were independent and wealthy enough to serve without needing to be paid. But of course, it ensured that no working class people became MPs. Um, they called for universal manhood suffrage. Now, universal female suffrage is something that I'm going to look at in a later talk. They called for annual parliaments. They argued that MPs shouldn't be representatives, but should be delegates. In other words, they should be delegated by their constituents to vote in particular ways and should be bound to report back annually that they had carried out the wishes of their constituents. They called for vote by ballot. It was still the case that secret ballots weren't used. In rural areas, for example, meetings were called where a show of hands for each candidate was taken, with the local squirearchy looking on to make sure that rural workers voted the right way. And they called for payment of MPs. Now, MPs not being paid meant that working men couldn't afford to stand for Parliament. So the Chartists, led by William Lovett and Fergus O'Connor, represented the high point in the 19th century of a long radical tradition. However, there were others within the leadership that were gravitating away from radicalism towards socialism. And some of those were people like James O'Brien and later leaders like George Julian Harney and Ernest Jones. And they made connections between political oppression and economic exploitation. Harney and Jones, in particular, were closely associated with Engels and Marx. So Karl Marx by this time was living in London as a political exile. Now, Chartism posed a great threat to the establishment. This is clearly shown by a general strike in 1842. Now, the immediate cause of the strike was a proposal by cotton manufacturers to cut wages by 25% because of a severe trade depression. However, the strikers also had the Charter as a central aim. At many meetings, strikers passed motions declaring that they'd not return to work until the People's Charter is the law of the land. Excuse me. And in 1848, which is known as the Year of Revolutions across Europe, a widespread wave of political upheavals swept across Europe, beginning in Sicily and spreading to France, Germany, Italy, the Austrian Empire, and other regions. And 1848, of course, is the year that Marx and Engels published the Communist Manifesto. In Britain, a huge Chartist demonstration massed on Kennington Common in London. They had planned to march to Westminster to present the third Chartist petition containing 2 million signatures. However, the government responded with mass arrests of Chartist leaders, including this guy, William Cuffay, the main organiser. He was tried for levying war against the Queen. He was sentenced to transportation for life to Tasmania. Chartism wasn't defeated in 1848, but it never again became a national mass movement, partly due to bitter internal divisions and partly due to an economic boom. Indeed, reaping the benefit of our early industrial lead, Britain had a monopoly of world trade. Britain became known as the workshop of the world, and skilled craft workers benefited greatly from this. They were called the aristocracy of labour, and they became the backbone of trade union revival following the demise of Chartism. It was called New Model Unionism, and I'll distinguish later on between that and what's called New Unionism. New Model Unionism, as it became known, was very different to earlier trade unions. Most of them were reformations of already existing craft organisations or workers' guilds. The Amalgamated Society of Engineers was formed in 1851 and became the model on which others, such as the Amalgamated Society of Carpenters and Joiners, were based. They were organised nationally and were highly centralised. They levied high membership dues and because of that were able to employ full-time officials and offer improved friendly society benefits. These unions were exclusive rather than inclusive unions. In other words, you had to prove that you were an engineer to become a member of the ASE or a carpenter or joiner to become a member of the Amalgamated Society of Carpenters and Joiners. And this was in order to maintain their advantages over labourers. And they existed in this kind of form right up until the late 1960s, when I joined the Amalgamated Society of Woodworkers, which is what the Amalgamated Society of Carpenters and Joiners was renamed. I had to prove that I was eligible as a trained carpenter and joiner, and the branch that I applied to join had to, I had to stand up in front of the branch and say why they should accept me into the union. I was then sent out of the room while they discussed my application and to vote on whether or not I should be allowed to join. That was in the late 1960s. Generally, they were conservative with a small c, and often they supported conservative candidates, conservative with a large C, in elections. and women were excluded from most of these craft unions. Now, strikes did continue, but they were less common as negotiation and arbitration came to be accepted practices as ways of securing improvements in wages and conditions. In 1850, there were roughly only about 100,000 trade union members. By 1868, the Trade Union Congress, the TUC, representing all affiliated trade unions, was founded at the Manchester Mechanics Institute, as you can see here. It was convened by the Manchester and Salford Trades Council. By 1874, just 6 years later, trade union membership had risen to over 1 million. After that, there was a sharp decline in membership, reflecting the strong associations of new unionism with Britain's economic fortunes. In other words, this kind of conservative, protectionist, and sectionalist trade unionism only does well when capitalism is doing well. So there's some lessons to be learnt there for those who are trade unionists. So the working class once again turned their attention to fighting for parliamentary reform. With the support of Marx and Engels, in 1865, the International Working Men's Association, together with many trade union leaders, set up the Reform League to campaign for one man, one vote. And I sometimes wonder if voters for Farage's fascist party today realised that reform meant something completely different then. Probably not. From 1860 to 1867, there were struggles over extending the franchise. The ruling elite, both Tories and Liberals, regarded this as an unjustified attempt to democratise society and overthrow the establishment. They viewed it as class war, which indeed it was. And we can see that from some of the statements that were made by both Tory and Liberal MPs in Parliament during the period from 1860 until reform was agreed in 1867. One Liberal MP warned of the dangers of handing the vote to the great masses of half-educated men. It was argued that once trade unionists had the vote, they'd demand a reduction in the working day to 8 hours. Disraeli argued it would enfranchise 203,000 people, and these people would cast their votes for socialist change. Lord Palmerston also opposed the extension of the franchise, saying, all of one class bound together by the same entitlements and habits, we are conferring power on a class. And also, in response to Gladstone's proposed new reform bill, one Liberal MP said this: it would give great power to the agitating but secret leaders of the unions. The direct consequence would be an increased and plausible cry for the ballot and the introduction of men into the House of Commons who would be following impulses not congenial to our institutions. So they recognised it was class war. And one particular response from one MP said, if you want venality, if you want ignorance, if you want drunkenness and facility for being intimidated, or if on the other hand you want impulsive, unreflecting and violent people, where do you look for them in the constituencies? We know what these people are who live in small houses. The first stage, I have no doubt, will be an increase of corruption, intimidation, and disorder. The second will be that the working men of England, finding themselves in a full majority of the whole constituency, will awake to a full sense of their power. So they knew it was naked class war. So Gladstone's proposals for extending the franchise were thrown out by Parliament. The new Prime Minister, Benjamin Disraeli, presented a watered down version of Gladstone's bill, saying, "We do not live, and I trust it will never be the fate of this country to live under a democracy." So, this is a great Tory hero, Disraeli. Disraeli's bill was passed in 1867. The Reform League, which I mentioned a little while ago, condemned it as partial and oppressive and reaffirmed its commitment to a vote for a man because he is a man. They organised a giant demonstration in Hyde Park, which the government warned was illegal. Despite the deployment of troops and the swearing in of thousands of special constables to stop the rally taking place, 500,000 people turned up and the government were forced to withdraw its forces. The Tory press, as usual, claimed that there were only 20,000 demonstrators. Some things never change, do they? But this was the first time that any political organisation representing working class people had openly and successfully defied the law. Many argued that this was revenge for what happened at Peterloo. Disraeli subsequently amended the bill. Robert Lowe MP complained that this would give the vote to Wiltshire labourers earning 8 shillings a week, and that these people would not vote for either the Liberal or Conservative candidates. What will their politics be? With every disposition to speak favourably of them, their politics must take one form or another of socialism. And with this reform, we are going to make a revolution. After several amendments, the bill gave the vote to about 1.5 million men. The trade unions were quick to exploit the new opportunities presented by the extension of the franchise by taking on some of the functions of a parliamentary pressure group. The TUC's Parliamentary Committee was formed in 1871, and that was the forerunner of what we now know as the TUC General Council, which is seen here much later. Because some working men now had the vote, both Liberal and Tory administrations were prepared to countenance some reforms to labour laws in order to curry favour with the working class. So the Trade Union Act of 1871, for example, recognised unions as legal entities, as corporations, and as such were entitled to protection under the law. The Employers and Workmen Act of 1875 set a 10-hour limit on the working day. Trade unions had campaigned for 8. The Conspiracy and Protection of Property Act of 1875 decriminalised picketing, And it's interesting that this was done by a Tory government after the previous Liberal government had criminalised picketing. So the Liberal Party under Gladstone once again won a parliamentary majority in 1880, and Gladstone set about introducing a bill to extend the franchise even further. Some Liberals wanted it extended to women. There was great opposition from Queen Victoria, from Tory MPs and the Tory dominated House of Lords. There were demonstrations held by working people in support of Gladstone's bill, like one organised by the London Trades Council, shown here. One Tory MP argued, "The men who demand it are not the working classes. It is the men who hope to use the masses who urge that the suffrage should be conferred upon a numerous and ignorant class." Opposition meant that Gladstone was once again forced to water down the bill, and in the end, the franchise was extended to about 2/3 of adult males. The working class vote therefore became important to both parties, and the Tories were just as keen as the Liberals to use it to their advantage. The Liberal Party, in a strategy known as Lib-Labism, supported some working men as election candidates in selected constituencies. But by the 1880s, a strong, though narrowly based, craft-orientated trade union movement had been created, as I said earlier. However, the economic boom was now over, and the ensuing depression questioned the complacency of right-wing trade union leaders and the new model unions. The economic slump, coupled with an inability of new model unionism to address issues facing the great majority of working people in the late 1880s, was responsible for the rise of a mass labour movement. Trade unionism spread to previously unorganised workers. The militancy and Marxist ideology of what became known as New Unionism rocked the complacency of the old leadership. This new mood was inspired by a revival in socialist activity. In 1888, when this started, there were roughly just 750,000 trade unionists. By 1918, I'm jumping forward a little bit here, just 30 years later, it had risen to 6.5 million working men and women were trade unionists. The catalyst for a surge in trade unionism amongst largely unskilled and semi-skilled workers was the Bryant and May match-girl strike in Bow, East London in 1888 that exposed the appalling conditions that 1,400 women worked under in the factory. At the time, it was the largest factory in London. The strike was sparked by the dismissal of several workers, but the roots of the strike lay in years of brutal exploitation. The workers who endured 14-hour days, meagre pay, and a punitive system of fines for minor offences like talking, dropping matches, or even having dirty feet, meant that some weeks Some workers received no wages at all because it had all been taken away in fines. But the most horrifying thing about the Bryant and May factory was the risk of what was called phossy jaw. It's the proper name for it is phosphorus necrosis, and it's a gruesome disease caused by exposure to white phosphorus that causes, excuse me, the jawbone to rot and could lead to organ failure and a very painful death. 1,100 girls walked out and formed the first trade union for unskilled workers. The strike gained national attention after social reformer Annie Besant published an expose titled White Slavery in London, which contrasted the factory's high dividends for shareholders and the lavish lifestyles of the owners with the starvation wages of its workers. Though Besant is often credited with leading the strike, it was the workers themselves, led by figures like Sarah Chapman, who you can see in the middle at the bottom there, who, with Besant's help, started the first women's trade union and initiated the walkout. So, to be fair to Annie Besant, she always dismissed claims that she started the strike and insisted that it was the girls or women themselves. Their victory was swift and significant. Within 3 weeks, management abolished the fines system. They reinstated all sacked workers. They agreed to provide a separate room for meals to prevent phosphorus contamination. And they also employed a doctor to check the women regularly for contamination. So it was a total victory over the Liberal Party supporting Quaker owners who were shamed into capitulating. Now, a lot of people have said, but they were Quakers. Why did they behave like this? And I've read a lot of the documents, and I think the answer is that May had left the business in disgust earlier. So it was Bryant, but it wasn't so much Bryant anyway. It was his sons who had taken over the running of the business. But anyway, the point is, it was a pivotal moment for organised labour, and it paved the way for the modern British labour movement. Just incidentally, that's the old factory at the top, and all its grounds. It was turned into what is now called the Bow Quarter, which is a collection of flats and workshops and leisure spaces, but the old facades still remain. On my fortnightly trips to the London Stadium to see my team West Ham play, I usually park in the road that backs onto these historic buildings, so I know it quite well. But inspired by the success of the match girls, there were waves of strikes by unskilled and semi-skilled workers. There was a national gas workers' strike in 1889. And then came the Great London Dock Strike of 1889. At that time, nearly half the world's shipping went through the London docks that employed over 100,000 men. So the strike was hugely significant. It drew attention to the problem of poverty in Victorian Britain, and the dockers' calls attracted considerable public sympathy. Led by socialists like John Burns and Tom Mann, with Eleanor Marx, Karl Marx's daughter, as secretary to the strike committee, the dockers' struggle captured the public's imagination. It lasted for 5 weeks. It was over the issue of casual working. They demanded a minimum of 4 hours a day and a minimum wage of 6 pence an hour. The Dockers Tanner strike, as it became known. For those of you who are too young to remember, a tanner was the nickname of the old sixpence, 2.5p in today's money. The strike resulted in victory for 100,000 strikers and established an important milestone in the development of the British labour movement, symbolising the growth of new unions of unskilled and poorly paid workers, in contrast to the craft unions already in existence. The central slogan of this movement was the demand for an eight-hour day, a demand of the international labour movement popularised by the newly formed Second International between 1889 and 1914, which was an alliance of European socialists and trade unionists who attempted to give practical expression to Marx's famous slogan, "Workers of all countries unite." A huge May Day demonstration in 1890 took even its organisers by surprise. However, the many gains of new unionism were reversed by 1891 owing to a counter-offensive by employers. Once again, workers turned to the political arena. However, they could only realistically vote Tory or Liberal. So the 1890s saw a number of important socialist organisations created. First of all, there was the Social Democratic Federation. That had been established as Britain's first organised socialist political party by Henry Hyndman back in 1881. Those joining included William Morris, and you might know William Morris through arts and crafts, George Lansbury, James Connolly, who was, of course, involved in the Easter Uprising in Dublin, and Eleanor Marx. Although it was a Marxist party, Engels refused to join because of Hyndman's autocratic leadership and obsession with parliamentary politics at the exclusion of class struggle through trade unionism. In fact, Hyndman was a very strange and dictatorial man for a Marxist. Many members, including prominent figures such as Ben Tillett and George Lansbury, left the Social Democratic Federation for the Independent Labour Party when it was formed in 1893. The ILP was established at a conference in Bradford, chaired by Keir Hardie. It was more heavily influenced by Christian socialism than by the Marxism of the SDF. The policy, however, was to secure the collective ownership of the means of production, distribution, and exchange. Tom Mann was the first General Secretary. The third major political force at the time was the Fabian Society, which was formed in 1884. It was the most theoretical of the non-Marxist organisations, and initially it played very little part in the fight for independent labour representation, preferring instead a policy of permeating the Liberal Party. As a predominantly middle-class organisation, much of its effort was devoted to scholarly research into all manner of social and political questions, with leading members like Sidney and Beatrice Webb becoming acknowledged experts in their field. They had a journal called Fabian Research, but that was later renamed Labour Research, which still exists today. On a practical level, it was a Fabian boast that they'd defeated Marxism in London through their assiduous work in nurturing a Liberal Labour alliance which had captured control of the newly formed London County Council in 1889. What was called their gas and water municipal socialism and gradualist rather than revolutionary philosophy established a tradition of attention to detail at local government level, which its supporters argued brought more tangible benefit to the working class than all the Marxist polemic put together. In the 1895 general election, the Independent Labour Party stood 28 candidates, but between them, they only won 44,000 votes. That's in total between 28 candidates. Keir Hardie believed that to obtain success, it would be necessary to join with other left-wing groups. In 1899, a Doncaster member of the Amalgamated Society of Railway Servants proposed in his union branch that the TUC should call a special conference to bring together all left-wing organisations and form them into a single body to sponsor parliamentary candidates. The motion passed all stages of the TUC, and the proposed conference was held here in February 1900. It was attended by a broad spectrum of working class and left-wing organisations, including the Social Democratic Federation, the Independent Labour Party, and the Fabian Society. Trade unions were represented by about 1/3 of the membership of TUC delegates. There were 129 delegates in total, and they passed Keir Hardie's motion to establish a distinct Labour group in Parliament who shall have their own whips and agree upon their policy, which must embrace a readiness to cooperate with any party which for the time being may be engaged in promoting legislation in the direct interests of Labour. This created an association called the Labour Representation Committee. Initially, many trade union leaders were very lukewarm about the Labour Representation Committee, and then something happened. In 1901, they were shaken out of their complacency and became much more enthusiastic about getting parliamentary representation. Support for the Labour Representation Committee was boosted by the 1901 Taff Vale case, a dispute between strikers and a railway company, which ended with the union being ordered to pay £23,000 damages for a strike. The judgment effectively made strikes illegal because employers could recoup the cost of lost business from the unions and bankrupt any union whose members went on strike. So it became vital for working people to get representation in Parliament as quickly as possible to reverse this ruling. So I'm coming to a close now. In the 1906 general election, the Labour Representation Committee won 29 seats, which was helped by a secret 1903 pact between the Labour leader Ramsay MacDonald and the Liberal chief whip Herbert Gladstone that aimed to avoid splitting the opposition vote between Labour and Liberal candidates in the interest of removing the Tories from office. In their first meeting after the election, the Labour Representation Committee group's MPs, seen here, decided to adopt the name the Labour Party. Keir Hardie was elected the first leader of the Labour Party. And it's interesting to note also that the party didn't have individual membership until 1918, but operated as a coalition of affiliated trade unions and socialist societies. One of the first acts of the new Liberal government, with the support of Labour, of course, was to reverse the Taft Vale judgment. So that's how the Labour Party came about. And that's where I want to leave it. Thank you very much for listening. That's let's take that down. Stop the share. I think you got one in the chat, are we?
Thank you, Jack. I'm gonna open up the chat for
Right. Oh,
people.
you done that. Yeah. Right. People can either put a question in the chat, or if you want to stick here, there's a hand that you can stick up in React. You can put raise hand like that, if you can see my picture, and then you can lower hand.
The chat should be open now, but I'm not sure if people want to try that. Oh yeah, there you go. Thank you, Susie.
Thank you, Susie. Thank you, Susie. It's very kind of you. Right, has anybody got a hand up?
I'm not sure they can do it. I'll just check.
Oh, right. Can see Katie's here. It'd be nice if people are going to raise a question or ask something that I see their face, especially as some of you I don't know. Some of you I've spoken to on Facebook and other places. So it'd be nice to see a face.
Can I ask a question, Jack, in the meantime?
Yeah, go on, Claire. Yeah.
I was just wondering if the Reform Party now had deliberately took their name from the original Reform group.
Do you think they're that clever?
No,
I'm not so
no,
sure they're that clever. I don't know. Maybe.
no, yeah. Well, I mean, it's quite a common thing, isn't it? Reforming something, so,
Yeah. Yeah.
but perhaps not then, but
Yeah, it's Steve has asked a question. Do I have to sign up for each session going forward, or does this one enable me to attend each Monday session? No, Steve, you have to sign up for each session. I think that's right, isn't it, Katie?
is Katie there?
Yeah, Katie's here. Can you, oh, ask to unmute. Yeah. Um,
Okay.
there you are.
Hello.
Hello, Katie.
I think it's the same Zoom link, isn't it, for everyone? So
Oh,
I'm not sure. I have set them up that people have to sign up for each one individually. But if it's the same Zoom link, I'm not sure. It might be easier to I don't know. I'd have to check it out. Sorry,
It
I
is the
wasn't
same
expecting
Zoom
to be
link.
on the camera.
It's the
yeah.
same Zoom
I,
links.
I, I think, Steve, if you go and check it out, I think it might be the same Zoom link. But I've I always, if even if I'm doing the presenting on a Zoom, I always join myself, and I've joined for all 10. So But if it's the same Zoom link, I
I
don't
think it
know.
is.
Oh, right. Okay. We'll check that out. Okay. I mean, John's put a good question there. Uh, it struck me a few times as you were going through the history, how many of the struggles and arguments are repeated numerous times and are still happening today. I think, that was one of the things that struck me. And somebody actually said to me, "Why do you want to talk about history?" And I said to them, "Well, there's a famous phrase, if people don't learn the lessons of history, they're bound to repeat the mistakes." Um, so yeah, I think it's quite true. Um, that yeah, some of the things do ring true today. Yeah, yeah.
Like what, Jack? What would you say is similar?
Uh, I'd have to go back through my presentation, but I mean, some of the things while I was talking, I'm thinking, yeah, that's relevant to today. I mean, for example, the debate that's going on in your party at the moment about dual membership. I mean, those debates went on in the formation of the Labour Party about whether people should be members of the SDF and the ILP. I mean, my parents were members of the ILP back in the 1930s. They did leave eventually, but uh, yeah, those debates went on. And in fact, when the Communist Party was formed in 1920, they were proscribed, and they were the first socialist organisation to be proscribed by the Labour Party. Now, I'm not making a comment whether these things are right or wrong, but it is history repeating itself. I mean, that's one thing. The way in which protest is being suppressed. I mean, we've seen with Palestine Action, for example, people holding up, 90-year-old pensioners in wheelchairs holding up a bit of cardboard are being arrested under the Terrorism Act. And one of the things that I found quite interesting was what's her name, the Home Secretary that brought that in. What's
Yvette Cooper.
Yeah, Yvette Cooper. Thank you. Yeah, Yvette Cooper, when she voted on that legislation to bring that in to proscribe Palestine Action. And do you know what she'd just come from just before she cast her vote? She'd come from a celebration of the suffragettes who did far more physical damage in their campaigning, and they were classed as terrorists at the time. So, it just seems so ironic that she came from a meeting celebrating the suffragettes to vote to make Palestine Action. Uh, so, we learn a lot of things from history.
Max has his hand up, Jack.
Yes, hello, Max.
Oh,
Yeah,
hello. Sorry, I didn't want to interrupt. And actually, I think it builds quite well, or I hope to build on John Pullman's comment just here in terms of the balancing between general campaigns and parliamentary politics. I'm curious in terms of the people and the pushes involved in terms of pushing for social reforms and workplace reforms and parliamentary politics. We see a cycle in terms of pushing for, or at least what I took from the lecture, a cycle of push for working condition reforms, and then and then get some grounds in workplaces, get some retrenchment, go back to politics. There seems to be this cycle, and I guess I'm curious in terms of the cam and to what extent I'm not sure, but actually getting that initial Labor caucus elected, getting them in 1906 elected, are the people working on those movements the same as who are agitating for a variety of social change? I guess is there a link even then between getting people together for to support a dock workers strike or to push for an extension of franchise and their political advocacy, or are they kind of separate streams at that point, separate groups?
I don't think there's a simple yes or no answer to that, to be honest. I think it's, some were
Fair.
involved in politics outside of Parliament, and some were, pushing for parliamentary reform, and some were involved in both, and saw both streams as being important. Um, I was struck when Tony Benn resigned as an MP, and when he was asked why he resigned as an MP, and he said, "I want to spend more time um, in politics," which is what he meant by that was most politics takes place outside of Parliament. Um, I'm not sure, my own point of view, if you want that, is that parliamentary representation is important, but we won't get that unless we engage in politics outside of Parliament, whether that's in trade unions or organisations like pressure groups and so on. Um, I think they go hand in hand, but we must get parliamentary representation at the end of the day, or we're not going to go anywhere. But that's
Thank you.
my view. I mean, other people may think differently, Max. But thanks, that's a great question.
No, thank
I just want to say there's a lot of comments about recording and coming back to take it in because it is quite a lot to take in if you've not come across this kind of sort of history of mobilizing and political upheaval. But it is being recorded. I'm not sure when it will be available, but we will let everybody know if that's okay.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Okay, somebody was putting their hand up. I don't know. No, that's a thumbs
Have a
up.
look. Jackie, it's Jackie.
Yeah, Jackie's was a thumbs up, was it? Yeah,
I think so. Well, it's just a thumbs up,
you.
yeah, so it's
yeah,
not a hand up. So
yeah.
I
If I
can't
could,
see any hands
oh,
up. I mean, everybody's
if I could be,
can everybody unmute themselves so that
Can you
uh,
have you muted them?
yeah, I will
Yeah,
try
can you
to
unmute everybody?
I've
And then
just
if you're
seen
not going to speak, if you can mute yourself individually, because
yeah,
it cuts
that's it.
down background noise.
Yeah.
quick, if I might chime in with another
Yeah,
question.
go on, Max.
Just curious, from the historical perspective, there was, I apologize, I don't remember the gentleman's name, it's in my notes, the trade union leader who was ultimately, he was involved in one of the, I believe it was one of the major gatherings, and then was sentenced to transportation to Tasmania. I'm curious, and which prompted a fair amount of pushback and public outcry. I'm curious as to the tail end of that story. What did he eventually return to return to
No,
England,
as far
or
as I know, no, as far
hmm,
as I know, William Cuffay didn't
okay,
return. And the
thank you.
thing was that the condition of the English working class was so bad for much of the 19th century that even though it was supposed to be a punishment to be sent to Australia, and indeed they were worked hard out in Australia and Tasmania and other places, the fact is many of them ended up having a better life. Two of the six Tolpuddle martyrs
Hmm.
didn't come back to Britain, they went to Canada. Um,
Oh,
yeah, yeah, they went to Canada rather than come back to Britain. They went to the New World. Um, so yeah,
thank you.
I used to like going to Tolpuddle Martyrs Festival because it always falls on my birthday that weekend.
yeah,
But just recently, because Labour's gone quite, well, it was always a little bit neoliberal, wasn't it? A lot of us
mm,
didn't realise how much, but yeah, so I've not really wanted to go as much lately, some of the speakers and they disallowed a film or something as well, didn't they?
yeah,
Mm.
yeah. Somebody's put, and it's got E. I don't know who E is. Um, there's a dominant narrative that progress is linear and we get more rights as time goes by. However, I think studying working class history shows that class war is a continuous struggle between periods of gains, which the establishment responds to with waves of repression. Yeah, that's a very good point. And I think you can see that throughout history. It isn't just modern history, of capitalism. We see that in waves of repression. So, for example, in the Middle Ages, we saw that against, the peasants' revolts. There were, major repressions after the 1381 peasants' revolt. Um, and, we have seen it in more modern times with the waves of repression since the 1970s, the gains that were made in the 1970s by trade unions, that we saw Thatcherism, and we're still to some extent recovering from that now, because we've had a kind of neoliberal agenda on attacks on trade unions and working class organisations, which has gone on for the last 40, 50 years. Hopefully things are gradually changing. Yeah, does somebody else want to come in?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah, who is that?
This is John Pullman. So I might have to put my headphones on.
Yeah,
Okay, can you hear me now?
can hear you, John. Speak
good.
up a little bit or turn your volume up.
Good. Okay, can you hear me better now?
Yes, that's much better, John.
Okay, yeah, it's this might come later on in the series, but I live quite close to. Well, I live in Poplar, so not that far
Oh,
from where you
right.
park your car to go and see
Yeah,
West Ham, near the
yeah,
Match Women's place and
yeah.
the docks, of course, and George Lansbury. But yeah, I saw a play a couple of weeks ago about Minnie Lansbury, one of the Poplar councillors who was imprisoned, and I was
Oh, right.
I was thinking about what you're saying about there's no point in having political representation in Parliament or I suppose in councils as well without any activity, any activism
Mhm.
to back that up. And I think we're sort of in a similar place now as they were then. That the councillors had to stand up to the government to try to basically it was not to pass a a legal budget basically which penalises their local constituents. And I think we're sort of the same now in that local government, they're just administrators of the grossly unfair rules that central government has imposed on local councils.
Yeah,
And I just thinking about your party and the local elections coming up, it's it's almost pointless. I don't think it is pointless. It means a lot and it builds into the wider movement, etc. But the amount of power that local councillors have without actually standing up to the state, to the establishment, to the government, to the neoliberal governments that we've had for the last 40 years, is almost pointless if it's not joined up to an actual campaign to change that. I'm not sure if there's a question in there really. I can't remember what I was actually going to ask, but what you were saying about needing activism as well as parliamentary representation. I think that's
yeah,
a pretty key thing.
yes, yeah. That's a good
Make it a
point.
question, isn't it?
Yeah, yeah, that's a good point. I mean, one of the things about local councils, you quite rightly say, they have, largely become. I'm not saying it's not a good thing to, vote one way rather than another in local councils because we can see what reform have done at Kent County Council, for example. Um, it's bloody awful what they've done, but they are hamstrung a lot, local councils now, by central government. And I think there's a lesson from history, which I don't know how many of you remember this. It was 1972 when we had a Conservative government who instructed local authorities all to raise their rents for council houses. And one particular council, it was called Clay Cross Council in Derbyshire, said, no, we're not going to, because it was a Labour controlled council. And the councillors said, we were all elected on a promise not to raise council rents, so we're not going to. And some of you may remember it, some of you may not, but the leader of the council was David Skinner, Dennis Skinner's brother. And also one of the other councillors was Graham Skinner, his other brother. They all decided that they were not going to raise council rents. And the Heath government, Tory government, told them they had to, or they would be debarred from standing for the council. They would be debarred as councillors. And I can't remember exactly what the law was, but they refused to stand down. They were all sacked as councillors, and new elections were called, and all their wives stood in their places. And so they got elected and still refused to increase council rents. And the Heath government backed down. So, it does take a special kind of person, I think. And you know what Dennis Skinner was like. His brothers were just the same. And I did meet David and Graham Skinner at one point. And they was just as militant as Dennis was. It does take a special kind of person to be able to stand up to central government. So, I don't blame any local councillor that can't, or local councils that can't stand up to the government, because, as you said, they don't have the power any longer to do so.
Thank you.
Okay, that's fine. Yeah, that's great.
We've got Anna Rose next, Jack, and then we'll have to leave it there, I think. Otherwise we'll
Yeah.
run over. Yeah.
Okay, Anna.
Thank you. Yes, a couple of points, and they're kind of negative points, but I want to find the positive in them.
Okay.
One is, I'm not sure, at least for people who are in the worst pickles in our country, things are getting better. I'm thinking particularly of disabled people and disabled people's families who are battling harder than ever to try to get nonsenses that go on, denonsense, try to get something civilized happening. People are being harmed. People are dying in the care system in shocking numbers. And it's only one group. If you look at homeless, if you look across the board at people who are in the worst pickles in our country, our prisons are an utter disgrace. It's quite hard to hold on to things getting better. I don't think they are. In
No.
a kind of related way, I don't know whether to despair or keep hoping your party will get on its feet. But when you mentioned squabbling in relation to a bit of your talk, because we're getting near the end, I won't try and find it. I am in despair about the squabbling, because I think we so desperately need your party to do the work that needs doing, that I am personally very angry with those people who are squabbling. It's not that we can't do it, we're never all going to think the same. That's not the issue. It's that we don't seem to have the self-discipline to say there's a very serious job of work to be done out there. We cannot afford squabbling at this day. We need to find what we can coalesce around and get on with that job. So there's frustration you can hear, and I want something to happen.
Yeah, I mean, to respond to, both your points, Hannah. I mean, the first one about, the plight of the disabled, the homeless, and so on, those at the very bottom. We used to have a welfare state, a modern welfare state, and it was one of the successes of the 1945 Labour government that created that welfare state. For all its faults, and it always had its faults, and I'll talk about some of those next week. For all its faults, it was a safety net for those and that is being eroded day by day. And it's awful what's happening to people at the bottom, and we need to do something about that as your party members. Your second point about the squabbling, I think both Katie and well, there's several West Suffolk members on here. There's Katie and there's Claire and there's one or two others from West Suffolk, Bury St Edmunds and Stowmarket group. What we try to do in our group, we have our differences. We don't agree on everything, but we try to create a welcoming atmosphere for everyone. And when I see some of the comments on Facebook amongst other groups, I like you, despair. But overall, I'm an optimistic person, and at 77 years of age, I'm still optimistic that we can get this off the ground and that we can really make a difference. So hang on in there. Hang on in
May
there.
I say that you putting on this series is a sign of what's fantastic about your party.
Good, good. Thank you very much. Yeah. Well, it was just one of the things I suggested and hoped it would go down well. So thank you, Anna, and thank you everybody who came, and thank you for your comments. We'll pick up next week. I'm going to deal mainly with the 1945 election and the Labour government of 1945 onwards, but I'm going to look backwards from that to see what led up to it. Look back to the First World War and up to the 45 Labour government, and then see, why did they fail in 1951 when they did so many good things? So, hopefully you can all come along to that, and we'll see you all next week.
Brilliant. Thank you, Jack.
Okay, it's fine. Yeah, thanks. Thanks for coming, everyone. Are we all done, Claire?
Yep, that's lovely. Thank you, Jack. Thank you, everyone. See you next time.
Okay. Yeah, I'll see you next time.